Michelle Jones had always been the person everyone turned to. In her hometown of Asheville, North Carolina, she was known as the kind-hearted woman who would stop at nothing to help those in need. Michelle wasn't just a mother, a wife, or a neighbor. She was a rock, a constant in the lives of her family and the community. She had a smile that could light up the darkest room, and her laughter, often heard echoing down the street, was a soundtrack to the neighborhood. People trusted her, relied on her, and saw in her a sense of calm and warmth that made the world feel safe. Born and raised in Asheville, Michelle came from a modest background. Her parents had instilled in her the values of hard work, compassion, and loyalty. She had always been the person to lend a hand, whether it was organizing community events, volunteering at the local food bank, or simply offering a listening ear to a friend going through a tough time. Michelle was a person you could depend on. She was the glue holding together the fabric of her family and her community. At the age of 24, Michelle had married Adam Jones, a man she believed to be her soulmate. Adam had moved to Asheville several years before they met, working as a carpenter and quickly making a name for himself with his craftsmanship and hard work. Like Michelle, Adam had an approachable nature. He was charming, always ready with a joke, and seemed to fit perfectly into the peaceful town they called home. He was the type of man you could imagine sitting on a porch, having a beer with the neighbors, or hosting barbecues for the entire block. No one suspected any darker side in his personality. Michelle and Adam seemed like the perfect couple, compatible, affectionate, and always seen out together, whether it was a local festival, a Sunday church service, or simply walking hand in hand down Main Street. Their life, from the outside, appeared to be a picture of marital bliss. They had 2 children, a son and a daughter, and from the outside, their home was filled with the laughter and joy of family life. Adam was always there for Michelle, or so it seemed. But beneath the surface of this picture-perfect marriage, things were far from as they appeared. Adam's true nature wasn't apparent to most people. To outsiders, he was still the charming, generous man, always the life of the party, the dependable neighbor, the loving father. But behind the scenes, things were different. He had a temper, a short fuse that could snap at the slightest provocation. Michelle tried to shield her children from his outbursts, brushing off the occasional argument as a result of stress or long hours at work. But as time went on, the moments of tension became more frequent, and his behavior grew darker. At first, it was subtle, little things that Michelle would chalk up to him having a bad day or a rough week. But eventually, the cracks began to show. Adam's jealousy started to surface. He didn't like when Michelle spent time with her friends or engaged in her community activities. He grew possessive, constantly questioning her whereabouts, who she was with, and what she was doing. Sometimes he would get angry if Michelle was just a little too friendly with other men. Those outbursts weren't frequent, but they left a scar, a bruise to her spirit, that Michelle tried to ignore. She tried to justify his behavior, convincing herself that it was just a phase, that things would go back to normal. But normal never came. Adam's actions grew slowly, but surely. He became more controlling, demanding Michelle's full attention and even isolating her from friends and family. She no longer felt like the warm, social woman she once was. She had become someone who constantly watched her back, second-guessing every word, every move. She could sense that her once loving husband had begun to look at her differently, as though she were something to possess, something to control, rather than someone he loved. Despite her own growing discomfort, Michelle stayed. She stayed for the children. She stayed because she had always believed in the vows they had made on their wedding day, and because, deep down, she thought things would get better. She tried to make excuses for Adam, rationalizing his actions as the result of personal struggles. It was easier to make excuses than face the truth. But as Michelle would soon discover, the truth had been lurking in the shadows for far too long. By the time the violence began, Michelle was already walking on eggshells in her own home. The tension in their house was suffocating, but no one outside of it knew the depth of the strain. Adam had become unpredictable. One moment he would be charming. The next, he would explode in a fit of rage over something as trivial as a late dinner or a misplaced object. Michelle had tried to reason with him, to calm him down, but those efforts were in vain. What was once a marriage built on love, respect, and mutual understanding had been eroded by fear, manipulation, and control. Michelle's world had narrowed. She no longer recognized the man she had married, and yet she couldn't find a way out. In the quiet town of Asheville, Adam Jones was still the good neighbor, the friendly face everyone knew, and no one saw the monster lurking beneath that smile. To the community, Michelle was still the woman who volunteered at the local houses, who took time to talk to anyone in need, and who maintained a happy face even when her world was crumbling. She couldn't let anyone see what was happening in her home. She couldn't let anyone know that the very man she had trusted with her life was the one who was now tearing her apart. And then, one night, the darkness reached its breaking point. Asheville, North Carolina, was a town that seemed to exist outside the rush of the world. Situated between the Blue Ridge Mountains, it was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone. The streets were lined with towering oaks and sprawling brick homes, their front porches adorned with rocking chairs that seemed to invite long conversations and casual visits. The town had a sense of peace that made it feel like time moved slower here, as if the world's chaos couldn't reach this serene corner of the state. In Asheville, neighbors waved as they passed, and the scent of fresh-cut grass filled the air during the summer months. People took pride in their yards, their homes, and their families. The town was tight-knit, its residents bound together by generations of history, friendships, and shared experiences. No one expected a tragedy to strike here. And no one would have believed that beneath the deceptively calm surface, one of the most chilling acts of violence was about to unfold. Michelle and Adam's home was a quiet, two-story house on a peaceful street just a few blocks away from downtown. The house, like the rest of the town, reflected a seemingly perfect life, well-maintained, with a white picket fence, flower beds in the front yard, and a swing hanging from the oak tree in the backyard. It looked like something out of a picture book, the kind of home that spoke of comfort, safety, and family. But inside, it was different. The walls that had once echoed with laughter now held the quiet tension of a marriage on the edge. The rooms, once filled with light, had become shadows of what they once were. Michelle could no longer remember the last time their home had felt like a sanctuary. She no longer recognized the man she lived with, the man who was supposed to be her partner, her protector. Each day, the house felt smaller, the walls closing in on her, suffocating her. The year was 2009, and in the world outside their home, things were changing. The country was in the midst of a financial crisis, with people struggling to keep their jobs, their homes, and their livelihoods. The uncertainty of the economy only seemed to add to the growing pressure inside the Jones household. Adam's job, once steady, had been affected by the downturn, and the strain of financial instability weighed heavily on him. But it wasn't just the economy that was causing the strain. It was something darker. Adam's temper had been building, each angry word a warning that things were about to erupt. On the outside, they were still the Joneses, the perfect couple in the eyes of their friends and neighbors. They attended church every Sunday. They went to community barbecues. But the cracks in the disguise were beginning to show. Late one evening in November, when the trees outside were bare and the cold winds of winter began to creep in, Michelle and Adam were in their living room. The house was quiet, the children already in bed. The last few months had been filled with arguments, small ones at first, then larger ones, fueled by misunderstandings, hurt feelings, and the growing divide between them. The air was thick with unspoken words, and Michelle could feel it. Tonight, though, it felt different. The tension in the room was almost unbearable. Adam sat on the couch, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Michelle stood near the doorway, her body tense, ready to flee if things got worse. She could feel her pulse racing, the fear beginning to rise in her chest. This wasn't the first time Adam had gotten angry, but tonight, something felt off. He was silent, his eyes cold and distant. Michelle had learned to read his moods over the years. She could tell when a storm was coming. "Michelle," Adam finally said, his voice low but sharp, "you've been ignoring me. You've been gone too much. I can't take it anymore." Michelle's heart sank. She had been working more, trying to distract herself from the mounting tension at home, but the words hit her like a blow. She tried to keep her voice steady, her hands trembling as she responded, "Adam, I'm just trying to help. You know I'm doing this for the kids, for the family." But Adam wasn't listening. His face twisted with anger, and Michelle could see the familiar signs of a man losing control. She had tried to avoid confrontation, but she knew it was inevitable. Every word she spoke seemed to make him angrier, and the tension in his body was unbearable. Michelle's mind raced. She needed to stay calm, to diffuse the situation, but she felt powerless. Without warning, Adam stood up immediately, knocking over the lamp beside the couch. "You think you can just walk away from me? You think you can just leave me here while you're off doing God knows what?" Michelle froze, her eyes wide with shock. She knew what was coming, but it didn't make it any easier. His anger was so sharp, so overwhelming, that it cut through the air like a knife. "Adam, please," she said, her voice shaking. "I'm not leaving you. I'm just trying to keep things together." But Adam was beyond reasoning. His anger had clouded his judgment, and he wasn't hearing her anymore. With one swift movement, he grabbed her by the wrist, pulling her toward him. Michelle gasped in pain as he jerked her closer. This wasn't the first time he had been physical with her, but it was the first time in a long while that she had felt the full force of his rage. Panic gripped her, and she tried to pull away, but his grip was too strong. For a moment, it felt like time stopped. The world outside their home, the world of neighbors and friends, of church services and community gatherings, seemed so distant. There was only the suffocating weight of Adam's anger and Michelle's desperate need to escape. And then, in the midst of it all, Adam said something that made her blood run cold. "You're going to regret this, Michelle. You're going to regret ever trying to leave me." The words hung in the air, heavy with menace. Michelle's heart raced. She had heard him say things like this before, but tonight, she knew he meant it. The threat was clear. He wasn't just angry anymore. He was willing to take things to a place they hadn't been before. The night seemed to stretch on forever, each minute weighed down with the unspoken knowledge that something terrible was coming. Michelle stood frozen, the weight of Adam's words pressing against her chest. His voice had shifted. Gone was the pleading, the self-justification. What remained was something colder, harder. She had heard him angry before, had seen him lash out in frustration, but tonight was different. His grip on her wrist was firm, unyielding, as if he were trying to mold her into something that would never leave. "You're going to regret this, Michelle. You're going to regret ever trying to leave me," Adam repeated, his voice low but full of promise. The words, no longer an empty threat, hung in the air like a storm cloud. Michelle's heart pounded in her chest, each beat loud in her ears. She had heard him say similar things in the past, but never with such conviction, never with such an underlying truth. Her body trembled as she tried to pull free from his grasp, but his hold tightened. She could see the darkness in his eyes, a part of him she had never fully wanted to acknowledge. The man she had once married, the man who had promised to love her, to cherish her, was slipping away into something unrecognizable. The warm, loving man she had known was being replaced by a stranger, someone who now wanted to control her entirely. Michelle had been trying for years to make their marriage work, to hold everything together. She had convinced herself that things could get better, that she could help Adam fix what had broken. But tonight, as she stood there, caught in his grip, she realized the bitter truth. No matter what she did, no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't fix him. She couldn't make the man she had fallen in love with come back. She had tried before, tried to talk to him, tried to reason, tried to appease him, but Adam wasn't listening anymore. Each time she spoke, it seemed to push him further away, deeper into the anger that had started as frustration but had grown into a consuming force. And tonight, it felt as if it had reached a breaking point. His words cut through her like a knife, and for a moment, she felt paralyzed. Her mind raced, but the thoughts were chaotic, tangled. What was she supposed to do? Was she supposed to fight back? Was she supposed to leave? But she couldn't leave. Not yet. Not with the kids sleeping upstairs. Not when she didn't know where to go or how to escape him. "Please, Adam," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Let me go. This isn't us. This isn't you." He didn't answer. Instead, he jerked her closer, and she stumbled, feeling the coldness of his presence like a weight on her chest. For a moment, she thought he might let go. But then he spoke again, and this time his words weren't a plea. They were a command. "You're mine," Adam said, the words heavy and final, leaving no room for argument. "And you'll always be mine, no matter what you think." The pain in Michelle's wrist wasn't just physical. It was emotional, a sharp reminder of how far things had fallen, how broken their relationship had become. She had been trapped for so long, locked in a cage she had built for herself, unable to see how much she had changed. The woman who had once been so full of life, the woman who had given everything to this man, was now nothing more than a shadow of herself, slowly fading. And yet, in the midst of the suffocating fear, Michelle felt something stir within her, a spark. It wasn't strong, but it was there, a wave of determination. She wasn't sure where it came from, but she knew she couldn't let this be the end. She couldn't let this be the moment that defined her. "Let me go, Adam," she said again, this time more firmly. "I won't stay here anymore. I can't." His grip didn't loosen. If anything, it tightened. And yet, in that moment, something shifted in her. Michelle realized that she couldn't continue living in this fear, in this cycle of abuse. The man who stood before her was no longer the person she had married, and she wasn't the woman she used to be either. She had tried to protect him, always tried to keep the family together, but now she saw the truth for what it was. Adam wasn't the man she had fallen in love with, and she wasn't going to let herself be broken by him anymore. The last few months had been a haze of attempts to regain control, to fight the constant erosion of her self-worth. She had tried to smile when others asked how things were going. She'd even pretended in front of her children that everything was fine, that their father was the man he had once been. But now, standing in front of him, feeling the weight of his body pressing closer, she knew she couldn't do it anymore. Michelle felt a deep sense of weariness settle into her bones. The exhaustion of years of emotional pain, of suppressing the constant dread of when the next outburst would come, was wearing her down. Every time she told herself that it would get better, every time she believed his promises of change, she was only fooling herself. He was still the same man, but her tolerance, her hope, had finally run out. She couldn't keep pretending anymore. As Adam's eyes narrowed, his face growing more rigid with each passing second, Michelle took a breath, a small act of rebellion. "I'm leaving you, Adam. I'm leaving this life, and there's nothing you can do to stop me." It wasn't the first time she had said it in her head, but it was the first time she said it aloud, and somehow, saying it out loud made it feel real. It was a declaration, a final warning, a line in the sand. Adam let go of her wrist for a moment, his face hardened into a frown. "You think you can just leave me like that? After everything I've done for you? After everything I've given you?" Michelle didn't answer. She couldn't. Words were no longer enough to change his mind. It was too late for that. The years of emotional abuse had led them here, to this point, where her decision wasn't a plea for understanding but a desperate plea for freedom. But Adam was not willing to let her go that easily. His next move was swift, his hand shooting out and grabbing Michelle's arm, the force of his grip almost knocking the wind out of her. "You're mine, Michelle," he repeated, his voice tight with fury. "You'll never get away from me. Not now. Not ever." Michelle gasped, a wave of terror crashing over her. This wasn't a threat anymore. It was a reality she could feel in every part of her body. Adam had crossed a line, and now she wasn't sure if there was any way to stop him. The tension between them was unbearable. Michelle could feel her heart racing, each beat hammering in her chest as though it might burst. Every inch of her body screamed for escape, yet she was paralyzed by the fear that had grown within her over the years. The same fear that had kept her from leaving. The same fear that had kept her trying to fix a broken relationship that was far beyond repair. Adam's face was twisted, his anger now fully consuming him. His grip tightened around her arm, pulling her towards him, and she stumbled again, this time knocking over a chair that had been carelessly left out of place. The loud crash of the chair hitting the floor seemed to snap Michelle from the fog of terror in her mind, but she couldn't focus on anything but Adam's tightening grip. She could see in his eyes that he was past reasoning, past calm conversations. This wasn't about love anymore, it was about control. And tonight, it seemed, he was willing to do whatever it took to make sure he remained the one with the power. "Don't you ever think you can leave me, Michelle?" Adam growled, his voice dark and low, almost unrecognizable. "You belong to me, you're nothing without me. Nothing." Michelle felt the venom in his words wrap around her like chains, suffocating her with each syllable. She had heard him say similar things before, but tonight they carried a weight she couldn't ignore. The chilling certainty in his voice made it clear he wasn't going to let her go. Not now, not ever. Tears welled in Michelle's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She wasn't going to give him that satisfaction. She had long stopped believing his lies, stopped thinking she could change him. No more apologies, no more promises of change. Tonight, she felt the full extent of what he was capable of, and the realization made her blood run cold. She tried to pull away again, but Adam yanked her closer, his grip like iron around her wrist. "I gave you everything, Michelle," he spat, his breath hot against her face. "And you're throwing it all away. For what? To run off with some other man?" The words didn't even make sense, and yet they were the words he used to justify his rage. Michelle knew she couldn't reason with him. Not anymore. His jealousy, his possessiveness, it was too much. It had consumed everything, twisted every good memory into something she had to fight to erase. She had tried for so long to hold on to the idea of who he once was, but now there was no denying it. The man who stood before her was someone she didn't recognize. She took a breath, steadying herself for what was coming. There was no escape. No matter how much she fought, no matter how much she begged, she was still here, still trapped, still at his mercy. "Let me go, Adam," she said, her voice shaking. "Please, let me go." Her plea was met with silence. Adam didn't answer. He just stared at her with those cold, hollow eyes that no longer held the warmth of the man she had once loved. In that moment, something in Michelle shifted. It was as if a switch had been flipped inside her, a quiet resolve settling in. She was done. She couldn't keep living in this nightmare. But as she tried to gather her strength to make her move, Adam did something she hadn't expected. With a swift motion, he shoved her backwards, sending her crashing into the couch. The air left her lungs as she landed, her body hitting the cushions hard. Before she could get up, he was on her, his hand around her throat, cutting off her breath. The world around her began to blur. Her vision swam, and her head spun. She gasped for air, struggling to breathe, but Adam's grip was too strong. This was the point of no return. This wasn't just a fight anymore. This was a battle for her life. Michelle's instincts kicked in. Panic flooded her veins. But beneath it, there was a coolness, a clarity she hadn't felt in a long time. She kicked and twisted beneath Adam's grip, desperate for any chance of escape. Her hands flew up, clawing at his, trying to pry his fingers away from her throat, but his strength was overwhelming. She couldn't break free. In that fleeting moment, Michelle thought about her children upstairs, asleep in their beds. She thought about how her life had led her to this moment, the years of suffering, of walking on eggshells, of believing that one day things might change. But now, she realized, she had to survive. For them, for herself. She found the strength to fight back, her knees connecting with his chest, knocking him off balance for just a moment. Adam stepped back, quickly loosening his grip. That was all the time Michelle needed. With a desperate rush of power, she pushed herself off the couch. Her breath ragged, and she was out of breath. She stumbled toward the door, her hands trembling as she fumbled with the handle. But Adam was quick, too quick. He grabbed her hair and pulled her back hard. "Where do you think you're going, huh?" he spat, his face twisted with rage. "You think you're just going to walk out? You belong to me." The words rang in Michelle's ears, each one sinking deeper, each one reinforcing the fear that had long taken root in her mind. She tried to scream, but the sound was lost in the overwhelming silence of the house. No one would hear. No one could help. Adam slammed her back against the wall, the impact rattling her bones. She winced, her head spinning. His breath was ragged, his rage uncontained. Michelle could barely keep her footing as he shoved her, his hands still gripping her body with a terrifying strength. "You're going to stay here," he hissed, his voice filled with venom. "You'll never leave me. No one will ever want you. You'll never be anything without me." The words stung. The manipulation was familiar. Adam had used this tactic before, making Michelle feel like she was nothing, like she was worthless without him. But tonight, it wasn't working. She had come to terms with the truth. He had no power over her anymore. But before she could gather her thoughts, before she could even make another attempt to free herself, Adam did something that shattered everything. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a bottle of gasoline. He didn't speak. His movements were quick, efficient, calculated. The bottle made a sound as he poured the liquid onto the floor, the scent of gasoline sharp in the air. Michelle's heart stopped. She knew exactly what he was about to do. Her mind raced, but her body was frozen in place as he turned on the lighter, a small flame dancing in his hand. "I gave you everything, Michelle," he said quietly, his voice almost mournful. "But this is how it ends." Before Michelle could react, the flame hit her. The fire spread quickly, hungrily licking the carpet, its heat immediately reaching her legs. She got scared, and she screamed, her entire body shaking as the fire's heat intensified. The flames moved too quickly, too forcefully. She had to move. She had to escape, but her body refused to obey. The fire was everywhere, surrounding her, chasing her. She ran, stumbling, her breath ragged as she tried to reach the door. But the smoke filled her lungs, and her vision blurred. And then, in that final desperate moment, Michelle's world went black. The world around her faded, swallowed by the suffocating darkness that closed in with each passing second. The last thing she remembered was the intense heat of the flames, the unbearable pressure on her chest as the fire consumed the room. The smoke filled her lungs, the heat making it almost impossible to breathe. Then, just as the fire seemed to burn her entire being, everything stopped. For a long time, Michelle couldn't tell if she had truly died, or if she was simply lost in an endless void. But then came a whisper, a faint whisper, like the softest breeze stirring the darkness around her. The sensation was distant, but real. Slowly, the blackness began to fade, and her body started to feel again. Her legs ached, her hands trembled. Her throat burned with every shallow breath she took, and when she tried to move, a sharp pain shot through her chest. She gasped, her body jerking forward as the raw, extreme pain took over her senses. But she was alive. Against all odds, Michelle was alive. It was a slow, agonizing process, her mind and body reconnecting, struggling against the damage that had been done. She forced herself to open her eyes, closing her eyes against the harsh light of the sun, but all she could see were blurred outlines. She felt disoriented, disconnected from her surroundings. Her vision cleared just enough for her to see a barren stretch of land. She was outside, her body lying on the cold, hard ground. The smell of smoke was still on her skin, her hair was messed up, and her clothes torn. For a moment, she couldn't understand what had happened. Where was Adam? What was this place? How had she gotten here? Her heart pounded in her chest as the terrifying realization hit her. She had escaped. She didn't know how, but somehow she had survived. She had fought through the flames, fought through the darkness, and made it out. And now, she had to find a way to keep going. Michelle took a slow, painful breath, the air burning her lungs as she pulled herself into sitting position. Her hands were raw, her fingers trembling, but she pressed them against the ground for support, determined to get up. Every movement felt like it took everything out of her, but somehow, her will to survive pushed her forward. Her vision was still blurry, and the world seemed distant, but she had to keep going. Her body screamed in protest, each step more difficult than the last, but Michelle forced herself to stand. The pain was overwhelming, but she couldn't stop. She had to move, had to get away from the house, away from Adam, away from everything that had nearly destroyed her. In the distance, she saw the faint outline of a road. She stumbled toward it, her legs weak and unsteady beneath her, but her eyes remained fixed on the goal. The road would lead her to safety. She knew it. The world around her was silent, except for the sound of her own labored breathing. The air smelled of burnt wood, of ash, of things lost in the fire. Yet in that silence, she found a small but powerful sense of resolve. The fire had not consumed her. It had not taken her life. And now, she was free. For the first time in years, she was free. It took every ounce of strength she had left to keep moving, but she did it. Every step, every painful breath was a victory. She didn't know how far she had to go, or if anyone would stop to help her, but the thought of returning to that house, to Adam, was unbearable. She couldn't go back. She wouldn't. Minutes turned into hours, but Michelle kept moving. She wasn't sure how long she had been walking when she finally collapsed, her body giving out from being very tired. The world around her spun, and she thought she might fall into unconsciousness once again. But this time, it wasn't because of the fire. It was because she had fought with everything inside her to survive, and now her body was telling her it needed rest. Somehow, Michelle had found a place to rest, an old shack by the side of the road, forgotten by time. She managed to crawl inside, her hands shaking as she pressed against the cold wooden floor. She couldn't remember how she had gotten here, but she knew one thing for sure. She had to stay awake. She had to stay alive. As the hours passed, Michelle drifted in and out of consciousness. Her body was bruised, burnt, and broken, but she refused to let the darkness take her again. Her mind flashed back to the last moments before the fire, before the final devastating confrontation with Adam. The anger in his eyes, the threat in his voice, the overwhelming certainty that he would do anything to keep her under his control. She had been afraid, but now, as she lay in the cold shack, her body trembling, she realized she wasn't afraid anymore. The fear that had once gripped her every day, the fear that had kept her locked in a cage of emotional and psychological torment, was gone. She had survived. And if she could survive that night, she could survive anything. Days passed before Michelle could truly understand the gravity of what had happened. She didn't know where she was or how long she had been walking, but she knew she had to keep going. She had made it out. And now, she had to make sure she never went back. Michelle didn't know exactly how much time had passed since that fateful night, but eventually, her body found the strength to walk again. She made her way to a nearby town. Her appearance was messy, her body covered in soot and burns, but there was a fire in her eyes, a fire that Adam couldn't take away, a fire that would drive her forward, no matter what. She found help in the small town, kind strangers who didn't ask questions, but simply gave her what she needed. She cleaned herself up, bandaged the wounds she could reach, and found a safe place to hide. She didn't know what she was going to do next, but she knew one thing. She was no longer a victim. She had survived, and that was something no one could take away from her. But as Michelle began to rebuild her life, the question still lingered in her mind. What would happen when Adam found out she had survived? When he learned that she had escaped, that she was still alive, would he come after her again? Would he hunt her down? determined to finish what he had started. She didn't know the answers, but she knew one thing. She wasn't going to let him destroy her again. She had survived, and this time, she was going to be the one in control of her own life. Michelle spent the following weeks in a haze of recovery and reflection. Her body, still scarred and broken from the night of the fire, was healing. But it was the emotional wounds that would take longer to mend. The fear that had consumed her for so long was still there, lingering in the back of her mind. She couldn't erase the images of that night. The flames, Adam's face twisted with rage, the moment she had thought she might die. But despite the pain, despite the memories that haunted her, Michelle felt something she hadn't in years: hope. The first steps to recovery were small: talking to doctors, finding a therapist who would listen, getting the support she so desperately needed. But the real battle, the one that would define her future, lay in what she would do next. She couldn't stay hidden forever. She couldn't live in fear, looking over her shoulder every day, wondering when Adam would find her. She needed to take control of her life, and that meant going to the authorities. It wasn't an easy decision. The trauma from that night still gripped her, making her hesitant to relive it, to face the world again. But Michelle knew that if she didn't speak out, Adam would never face the consequences of his actions. He would never be held accountable for what he had done. She couldn't let him get away with it. Not this time. It took everything in her to walk into the local police station to ask for help. She wasn't the same woman who had walked out of that house all those days ago. She was stronger now, more certain of who she was and what she needed to do. At first, the officers weren't sure what to make of her story. The evidence of the fire was clear: her clothes, her injuries, but there were no witnesses, and Adam had vanished without a trace. He had managed to make it look like she had been burned in an accidental fire, something that was not uncommon in domestic disputes. But Michelle's resolve didn't waver. She insisted that she had been attacked, that Adam had set her on fire, believing she was dead, and then buried her in a shallow grave. The investigation took time, and Michelle recalled the trauma. Every time she spoke about it, every time she described what had happened, the weight of the memory grew heavier. But as the days passed, the police began to uncover the truth. Adam's history of abuse was not hard to find. His past relationships, his temper, his violent outbursts, they all painted a picture of a man capable of the unthinkable. The investigation was thorough, but every step forward felt like a victory for Michelle. The authorities scoured Adam's records, spoke to people who had known him, and uncovered the horrifying truth. Adam had been a ticking time bomb. His abusive behavior had been escalating for years. And when Michelle had tried to escape, when she had tried to break free, he had decided that she would never leave him alive. The investigation was slow and steady. The search for Adam intensified. At first, it seemed like he had disappeared without a trace, as though he had vanished into thin air. The police found his car abandoned in a nearby city, but Adam himself was nowhere to be found. For weeks, there were no leads. Michelle's fear of him resurfaced, each day adding to the weight she carried. What if he found her again? What if he came for her, determined to finish what he had started? But just as the tension seemed unbearable, a breakthrough came. Adam was caught. It was a quiet evening when the phone call came. Michelle had just returned to the small apartment she had been staying in, her mind exhausted from the endless therapy sessions and paperwork she had to fill out. The call from the police was unexpected, but when she heard the words, she froze. They had found him. Adam had been living under a false identity, hiding in a remote area. The authorities had tracked him down, and he had been arrested without resistance. His face, once so familiar to her, was now splashed across the news. His expression a mixture of disbelief and anger as he was led away in handcuffs. The man who had nearly destroyed her life was finally in custody, and Michelle was going to get the justice she deserved. The trial was a long and difficult process. Michelle's courage was tested over and over again as she took the stand, recounting the unimaginable horror she had endured. It was painful, reliving every moment of the fire, the fear, the suffocating grip of Adam's rage. But each word she spoke brought her closer to the end of this nightmare. The lawyers tried to discredit her story, to paint her as unstable, to make it seem as though she had somehow caused the attack. They tried to twist her words, to suggest that she had been the one who pushed Adam to violence. But Michelle stood strong. She had nothing to hide. She had survived. And now the world would know the truth. The turning point in the trial came when Adam himself took the stand. His eyes met Michelle's for the first time in years, and for a moment she felt the weight of everything she had feared. The man she had once loved was now a stranger, a cold, calculating figure who seemed determined to deny everything. But as the trial unfolded, the truth became undeniable. Adam's history of violence, his lack of remorse, and the undeniable evidence of his crime all painted a damning picture. The jury deliberated, and after what seemed like an eternity, the verdict was read. Guilty. Michelle felt a wave of relief wash over her. The man who had nearly killed her, who had made her feel powerless for so long, was finally going to pay for his actions. He would never be able to hurt her again. She had found justice. But even as she walked out of the courtroom, feeling the weight of the verdict settle over her, Michelle knew that the road to healing was far from over. She had survived the unthinkable, and while the legal battle was over, the emotional scars would take time to heal. There would be days when the memories would threaten to pull her back into the darkness. But she was stronger now, and for the first time in years, she felt like she was in control of her own life. For the first time in years, Michelle could breathe without feeling the weight of fear and uncertainty crushing her every step. The trial had come to a close, and justice had been served. Adam was in prison, where he could never hurt her again. And now, for the first time, she had the chance to focus on herself, to heal, to rebuild, and to find her way back to the woman she had been before the nightmare started. But the journey toward recovery wasn't going to be easy. No one could expect it to be. Michelle's body had healed, but the scars that remained, both physical and emotional, would take much longer to fade. Every night, she would close her eyes, and the memories of that night, the fire, Adam's face, the suffocating pain, would come rushing back. It was as though they were embedded in her mind, and no matter how far she tried to run from them, they always followed. At first, Michelle was unsure of how to move forward. She found herself constantly second-guessing her every decision, questioning whether she was truly free or if the past would always hold her in its grip. There were days when the weight of everything she had gone through felt too much to bear, days when the darkness threatened to swallow her whole. But Michelle was stronger than she realized. With the support of her family and the community around her, she started to rebuild. Her parents, who had always been there for her, became her rock. They helped her find a new place to live, away from the town where she had once been so happy, away from the house that had been a prison. They helped her with the simplest of things, picking out furniture, arranging the small apartment, making it feel like a home again. Slowly but surely, the familiar comforts of family and love began to seep back into her life. She also found solace in the friendships she had nearly lost during the years of her marriage. Her old friends, the ones who had reached out to her even when she hadn't been able to respond, were there for her. They listened when she needed to talk, held her when she cried, and reminded her that she wasn't alone. They helped her see that while the road to recovery might be long, it was one she didn't have to walk alone. Michelle began to attend therapy, something she had avoided for so long. In the beginning, it was terrifying, reopening the wounds she had tried to keep closed for so many years. But with time, she started to understand that talking about the pain, about the trauma, was a crucial part of healing. It wasn't easy to face the parts of herself that had been broken, but she learned how to start putting them back together, piece by piece. She also found strength in helping others. Michelle knew she couldn't erase what had happened to her, but she could help others who were in similar situations. She began volunteering at homes for survivors of domestic abuse, sharing her story with those who needed to hear it. It wasn't easy, and at times, It felt like opening old wounds, but she found that by helping others, she was also helping herself. Each person she helped, each story she listened to, reminded her that she wasn't alone and that the human spirit, no matter how broken, could rise above. The more she gave, the more she received. Slowly, the pieces of her shattered life began to come together. Michelle's strength grew every day, and with it, her ability to forgive herself. She realized that she had spent so many years blaming herself for everything that went wrong, but now she understood that none of it was her fault. Adam's actions were his alone. She was not to blame for the violence, for the manipulation, for the control he had tried to exert over her. She had done everything she could to make things work, but some things were simply beyond her control. With each passing day, Michelle's confidence returned. She found a new sense of purpose in helping others, in building a future where she wasn't defined by the trauma of her past. She started working again, rediscovering her passion for helping others, something she had lost in the chaos of her marriage. Michelle had always been the type to give back, to be a positive force in the community, and now she was able to do that on her own terms. But healing wasn't a straight line. Some days were better than others, and there were times when the past would come rushing back, overwhelming her with memories of pain. On those days, Michelle would remind herself of how far she had come. She would close her eyes and think back to the woman she had been before, full of hope, full of love, full of life, and she would draw strength from that woman. The woman who had survived everything Adam had thrown her way. Her first year of recovery was the hardest. She struggled with nightmares, flashbacks, and the feeling that she was constantly looking over her shoulder, waiting for something terrible to happen again. But with each passing month, she grew stronger. She learned how to let go of the past, how to forgive herself, how to trust herself again. As Michelle's confidence grew, so did her sense of freedom. She took back the power that had been stolen from her for so many years, the freedom to make choices for herself, the freedom to live her life without fear. By the time her second year of recovery began, Michelle was no longer the woman who had been trapped in a cage of fear. She was no longer the woman who felt small, who had been made to believe she was worthless. She was a survivor, a woman who had found her strength again. She knew her journey wasn't over, that there would still be moments of doubt, still moments where the past would threaten to pull her back into the darkness. But she also knew that she had the power to overcome it. The scars would always be there, on her body, on her heart, on her soul, but they didn't define her. They were a part of her story, but they were not the end of it. Michelle had learned to live again, to love again, and to trust again. Her story was no longer one of victimhood. It was a story of survival, of resilience, and of the incredible strength of the human spirit. In the quiet moments, when the world around her settled into peace, Michelle would think about everything she had endured and everything she had overcome. She was still here, still fighting, still living, and nothing, not even the darkest of nights, could ever take that away from her. As Michelle stood there, the weight of everything she had been through seemed to lift. Her past would always be a part of her, but it no longer held the power it once did. She was no longer just the woman who had survived Adam's abuse. She was a woman who had reclaimed her life. Each day, she grew stronger. Each day, she found new meaning in the things she had once lost. Her hope, her dreams, and her sense of self were returning, little by little. But as much as Michelle had healed, she knew that the journey wasn't over. There would still be days when the memories would threaten to resurface, when the pain would knock on her door again. But she wasn't afraid. She had learned that even in the face of her darkest days, she could stand tall. She had learned that nothing, no matter how painful or overwhelming, could strip her of the strength she had found within herself. Michelle's recovery had not been easy. There were moments when she wondered if she could keep going, moments when the past felt like a heavy anchor pulling her down. But as time passed, as the days turned into months and the months into years, Michelle discovered something incredible. She was capable of more than she ever imagined. Her scars, both physical and emotional, became the foundation of her resilience. She had found her strength in the most unlikely of places within herself. But despite the growth she had achieved, there was one thing Michelle knew she still had to do: share her story. Her journey was hers, yes, but it was also a message to others who were struggling, others who felt trapped in their own stories. She wanted them to know that healing was possible, that there was hope beyond the darkness. She wanted them to understand that they were not alone. Michelle began speaking publicly about her experiences, sharing her story with others who had suffered from domestic abuse. She spoke to groups of survivors, offering words of encouragement and showing them that they, too, could survive. Her voice, once silenced by fear, now rang out loud and clear, a voice of strength and survival. Through her advocacy, Michelle found herself connecting with people in ways she hadn't expected. She met survivors who, like her, had once felt powerless but had found their own paths to healing. Together, they built a community of support, a network of people who understood the pain and the triumph of surviving abuse. And as Michelle continued her work, she found herself growing even stronger. She wasn't just helping others, she was helping herself. Every person she met, every survivor she spoke with, reminded her that her story had purpose. She had survived for a reason, and now she was using her experience to make a difference in the world. But Michelle's story wasn't over yet. She still had a life to live, a future to build. There were still moments of pain, still days when the weight of her past threatened to overwhelm her. But those days were fewer now, and when they came, Michelle knew she had the strength to face them. It was a quiet evening when Michelle found herself reflecting on everything that had happened: the abuse, the escape, the trial, the healing, and all that had come after. She stood by the window, watching the sunset as the colors of the sky shifted, casting a warm glow across the landscape. The calmness of the moment was a stark contrast to the chaos that had once defined her life. And yet, in that quiet space, she realized just how far she had come. The past was no longer something she feared. It was a part of her, yes, but it did not define her. Michelle was not just a victim. She was a survivor. And that was something she would carry with her for the rest of her life. She smiled to herself, feeling a sense of peace that had once seemed impossible. She had made it through the storm, and now she was standing in the light. What do you think about the actions of Adam? Can someone ever truly be forgiven for such a heinous act? Michelle's story is not just a tale of survival. It is a reminder that the human spirit can rise above even the darkest of times. But it also leaves us with questions that don't have easy answers. Can someone like Adam ever find redemption? Can a person who has caused so much pain truly change? Michelle's journey isn't over. There are still battles to fight, still moments of doubt and fear that may arise. But for now, she has found her peace. She has found her strength. And she has shown us all that even in the face of unimaginable darkness, we have the power to rise again. What do you think? Can someone like Adam ever change? Or does the damage done to victims like Michelle make it impossible for forgiveness to take place? Can true justice ever be served in situations like this? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Share your comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that keep you on the edge of your seat. Let's keep the conversation going. And remember, no matter what you've been through, you're never alone.